I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Tony Gregson, Chairman of Crawford, Victoria.
Thanks very much, Bill. My name is Tony Gregson and I'm the Chairman of the Victorian Committee of the Crawford Fund. Welcome everyone to this webinar, jointly hosted by the Ag Institute of Victoria and the Victorian Committee of the Crawford Fund. Two plugs before we start, if I may. First, if any institution or person is interested in the Crawford Fund training program, please see Sean Coffey, or here in Victoria, see Bill Lewis. And secondly, if anyone is interested in the Crawford Fund's mentoring program, please make contact with Colin Charteris, our CEO. And more generally, I encourage you all to follow the Crawford Fund through social media or make contact with Kathy Reed. Our webinar presentation today is to be given by Professor Tim Reeves. Tim has had a very distinguished career in international agriculture research and is one of, if not the, leading agronomist in Australia. Currently, he is Professor in Residence at the Dookie campus of the University of Melbourne. Tim is going to talk about resilience, risk and returns, the role of sustainable agricultural intensification of our agri-food systems. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about that. In introducing this talk, I think it's really important to point out that food systems are central to the meeting of the Sustainable Development Goals. The obvious ones around, obviously, nutrition, but in many other ways. And yet, as the world is tackling the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's clear that it's getting very, very difficult to be able to do that in relation to our agri-food systems. And, you know, as Sir John Beddington said in the UK back in 2009, that, you know, by 2030, we'll be facing the perfect storm. We've got to produce, you know, we're going to have more people, we've got to produce more food, but we're going to have to do it from less land and with less water, and with the impacts of climate change as a potential multiplier. And of course, these complexities are only getting greater as time goes on. And the reality is that when we're thinking about our agri-food systems, we've got to adapt to a riskier environment. Climatic risks, drought, heat, frost. Here in Australia, the frost season, the frost susceptibility season for our crops has increased from between 10 and 55 days. And of course, extreme events, climatic events. But there are also market risks and trade barriers. We're increasingly seeing inward-looking policies from countries and regions that are influencing our markets. And we're seeing supply chain risks, inputs, workforce particularly, and transport. And the COVID-19 pandemic is just exacerbating some of those effects. You know, some people say, well, you know, the pandemic has caused the workforce problem or has caused this. No, what it has done is exacerbate existing problems and the existing weaknesses that are there. And the reality is that all of these risks have increased in the past 10 or even 5 years. And so if we're not thinking about adapting more to risk, then we are putting ourselves in danger in relation to the sustainability of our agri-food system. And it doesn't matter whether you look globally, the impacts of forecast impacts of climate change on crop yields around the world, the redder the area, the bigger the impacts. Or you look here in Australia, and here we are sitting in most places in Australia, a very good year, but if you look back for the last 3 years, and this is right up to date, August 2021, the combined drought indicator for Australia shows that, you know, we are still in these much drier periods. even though obviously we have good years interspersed. And it's very clear from looking at this graphic here about our increasing temperatures from the time that records have been taken from 1910 to 2020. The more yellow orange, the warmer those years have been. And it's not hard to see that the last 20 years have been warmer than many others before them, in fact, most others before them. And so it's going to be a challenging world for our agri-food systems. Water going to be right at the forefront. 70% or more than 70% of global freshwater withdrawals used for food production. And so if we're going to be doubling food production at some time in the coming decades, certainly not going to be with twice as much water. And so these are the challenges and the growing risks around overcoming those challenges. So what I'm going to focus on today in our talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that we're doing here in Australia, in Victoria, to look at alleviating some of these risks around drought, talk about the Victoria Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. I'm going to talk about sustainable intensification of agriculture, a scientifically based pathway to more restorative and regenerative agriculture, and the theme that joins these together are more resilient and adapted farming systems, importance of soil health, of diverse farming systems to both increase returns and reduce risks. So let me start talking about our newly formed Victoria Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. It's a unique statewide partnership here in Victoria to enhance drought resilience on farms, in the environment, and in our communities. Some people, particularly in Australia, will look at Victoria and say, oh, that little green, well-watered state down there. But actually, the ABARES report from last year said that Victoria has the highest level nationally of flow-on effects of drought to household incomes and the highest levels of industry and community dislocation, and that Northern Victoria is amongst only 4 regions in Australia at the highest level of drought risk nationally. So we have targeted our hub at all Victorian regions, all agricultural production systems here, natural resource environments, regional communities, and regional businesses. It's a whole of state approach to enhancing drought resilience. Our hub design is that we have the hub headquarters here where I'm speaking from now, the University of Melbourne's Dookie campus in regional Victoria. And we've got 5 regional nodes to deliver and interact with farmers, landholders, and communities in those regions. And each one of those nodes is being run by a tried and trusted farming organization. And that really is the essence and the uniqueness of our approach, a grassroots, bottom-up approach, not a top-down approach. Our hub partners is again a unique collection. We have those 5 regional nodes, but we have 4 universities in this drought hub as well. And we have Agriculture Victoria, and of course we're funded by the Australian government through the Australian government's Future Drought Fund. This group of institutions has never collaborated in such a team to focus on anything. But what the Drought Hub has been able to do is to pull all of that strength together to be able to tackle enhanced drought resilience in the future. I mentioned the nodes. Their role is really around regional consultation and priority setting. It's about regional delivery. And what we want to make sure is that we get node to node learning as well as other things happening at the statewide, at the hub level. And as I said, these nodes are led by farming organizations that are well established and well trusted by the communities they're dealing with. Co-governance is a real feature of our hub, and we've got an oversight committee, representation from all the key investors. The working engine of the hub is the operations committee, and we've got a high-level advisory committee. So co-governance amongst all of those institutions, absolutely fundamental, as is co-design. We work together as a team to co-design the bid that we put in, and once that bid was accepted, we have worked hard on co-designing how we're going to tackle enhancing drought resilience. And we're going into a major consultation process with farmers, with regional communities, with land managers, local governments, on two parallel fronts. Obviously, we want to have some early actions. We want to identify what we should be thinking about and working on now, but we also want to have a legacy there. We want an evergreen process around developing these priorities. So it's not a sort of a quicken thing. Oh yeah, we got the hub, we're in, did 2 months work, got the priorities, and that's it. No, what we want to do is set up a process whereby priorities can be fed in around drought resilience for the whole life of the hub and beyond. And the other crucial thing we're doing in the co-design process is that we're using the climate drought cycle as an anchor for our co-design. So we're looking at what should we be doing now pre-drought? What should we be doing in that uncertainty period when a drought's on the horizon but hasn't come? What should we be doing during drought? And what should we be doing in that post-drought recovery? And we think this is absolutely critical as we look at the priorities that, you know, there are things now, we're in the middle of a great season, but what is it we should be doing now that is going to really enhance our resilience when, not if, the next drought arrives? One of the key themes, obviously, in the Drought Hub and some of the work we'll be doing will be around more resilient, more diverse and better adapted farming systems. And one of the things that we have been charged with in that Drought Hub is not business as usual. We have to be coming up with changes, transformational changes that are going to enhance risk management, drought resilience on farms. And so I see it in the broader sense as we're looking to build resilience and reduce risks on our farms, that it's not business as usual. This is about doing things significantly differently. Now, I'm old enough to have been through 3 major phases of farming in Victoria, in Australia, in fact. I was around when I first started work over 50 years ago when lay farming, pasture-based mixed farming was at its peak, but I also saw its demise. And then I saw more intensive cropping coming in, but still within that larger framework of lay farming, but more intensive cropping, particularly in the high rainfall areas initially, but then into the main cropping belt. And then I've seen that morph into continuous cropping. And it's my belief that what we're doing now in intensive cropping, it's been really good, it still is good, but it's unsustainable and mainly around the risk profile of those production systems. And I believe that sustainable intensification, critical now, and certainly going to be in the future. So I guess the thing that I have learned over my 50-odd years of working with farmers, working in agricultural research and development and extension is that sustainability is a moving target. You know, if you think, this is the Shangri-La, we'll go on doing this, history tells us that that will not be the case. And so what I've been going to be talking about today is what could those changes be that help us to keep pursuing that moving target of sustainability. As I mentioned, in our intensive cropping systems, wheat, other cereals, canola is the highest returning rotation that we can have. And that's been proven right across southern Australia from the west to the eastern seaboard. But the system is being challenged. The work of Svi Hockman and colleagues, said that climate trends account for stalled wheat yields in Australia since 1990. So over a 26-year period, yield potential due to warming temperatures, due to reduced precipitation, have actually cut the yield potential of wheat in Australia by about 1% a year. And in a region like the Victorian Mallee, yield potential going down by 100 kilograms per hectare per year. But what's happened is that yields haven't gone down because we've had technology gains, adaptation of our farming systems to reduce those actual yield losses. But the real question is, can we keep up that rate of technological change to meet the ever-increasing challenges that are coming from climate in Australia? And some of those changes, we're extremely good at. Conservation agriculture, whether we're looking at it on a broad scale in Australia, or we're looking at it in smallholder farms in South Asia. Absolutely critical in helping us to adapt our systems to a changing scenario. In the Australian context, keeping weeds out of our stubbles over the summer has transformed farming in the dry regions to be able to tap into any stored moisture gained from that practice. And it's really largely been unheralded, but it's been a major adaptation. But having said all those things, when we look at Australian average wheat yields, we start to see again this sort of plateauing out in the last 15 to 20 years. Some of that associated with the millennium drought, but others just the pattern of what is happening, and as Svi Hockman's work indicated. So what is it that we can do to not only increase productivity, but importantly, reduce risk? And this was a quote from one of our very best agronomists in Australia, John Kierkegaard. GRDC work. Economic modelling has revealed that while continuously cropped farms and mixed farms may have similar profitability in average seasons, the continuously cropped farm is better able to capitalise in good seasons, but at greater risk in poor. The less diverse continuously cropped farm had the lowest economic performance. This is from case studies. In all but the very best seasons when it made a large profit, he said. So continuous cropping is fairly risky. And so this is the thesis of my talk, that we need, of course, to be looking at returns. That's absolutely critical. But we also need to look at the context of the risks associated with those returns. Because when we look at returns on a gross margin basis, doesn't take any account of what this graph shows here. And this graph shows the accumulated nitrogen deficits across the Australian temperate cropping soils in the past 30 or so years. If you could put nitrogen on absolutely optimally, it'd be that slower accumulated deficit there, but in reality, it's probably more like this red line. Nowhere is that loss of natural capital tapped into the profitability of our intensive cropping systems. Likewise, nowhere is this decline in soil carbon, this is some work of CSIRO, factored into those economic returns. And yet here we are actually reducing natural capital and not accounting for it in the economics of what we do. And as a result of that, it's changing our farming systems and the risk profile around them. In this work here, quoted by John Kierkegaard, but from Sandeman and Baldock, what you're seeing is as soil nitrogen goes down from 108 down to 27, fertilizer nitrogen has to go up, and the percentage of the nitrogen cost as a percentage of the gross margin just is increasing at a time when climatic risk is also increasing. And so we've always been interested in soil organic matter and crop yields. And firstly, of course, because of the impacts on productivity. This is a recent global meta-analysis of the impacts of soil carbon, of soil organic matter on wheat and maize yields around the world. And so what it said was that 2/3 of the world's wheat and maize lands have less than 2% soil organic carbon, very similar to much of our land here in Australia. But if you could increase soil organic carbon to 2%, it increased potential wheat yields by 23%, potential maize yields by 10%, closed the yield gaps by 60% and 32% respectively, and reduced nitrogen fertilizer inputs. So absolutely clear from this meta-analysis, global meta-analysis of the impacts of increasing soil organic carbon on productivity. But there's a second reason that we focus on soil organic carbon, and this is a quote here from Professor Robin Batterham last year. That red writing is my addition to his slide, because all of these things in his dot points are about risk reduction. If we have greater soil organic carbon, we increase water holding capacity, we build drought resilience, we have less runoff and erosion, we have longer growing seasons, higher yields, big reductions in farm chemicals and fertilizers globally, looking at the impacts there, increased animal health and well-being, productivity increases, including ability to improve quality, target higher value products. Now, absolutely crucial, increasing soil organic carbon, soil organic matter in relation to productivity and these risk reduction factors. And I have seen this tremendous change in my time about how we have been looking to have enough nitrogen in our soils to produce our crops particularly. And when I first started, sometime in the early 70s, there was a paper that said, look, you know, that we get much more of our nitrogen from biological nitrogen fixation compared to bag nitrogen fertilizer in our farming systems, and the ratio was about 19:1, biologically fixed nitrogen to bag nitrogen. I asked a colleague 2 or 3 years ago what that ratio looked like now in Australia, and it was about 4:1, because we've got much less biological nitrogen fixation and much greater use of fertilizer nitrogen. And this has implications for our growing systems. And I'll come to that a little later, because one of the major factors is around the inefficiency of nitrogen use and the risk factors around using more fertilizer nitrogen in a changing climate. And so, which brings me to the third part of my talk, and around the pathways to sustainable agricultural production. We have what some are calling now industrial agriculture, you know, realistically our current conventional methods that are producing much of the world's food. And then there are some long established alternative pathways that people have been practicing really well, around organic farming, around biodynamic farming, and then much more recently, the headlines have been about, you know, regenerative agriculture. And with all of these things, there are some, you know, some real commonalities about holistic approaches, but there are some real differences as well. And I believe that sustainable intensification of agriculture picks up the key advantages of some of these systems and overcomes some of the disadvantages of those systems. And I want to talk a little bit about that now. What's very clear is that we need to enhance our current farming systems. They need to be more input use efficient. They need to use less water, less energy rich inputs, have less greenhouse gas emissions from an environmental point of view, but also from a social license point of view, the right to go on farming, where our systems need to be more diverse and resilient to climatic changes and to market changes. We need an increased emphasis on nutritional value of our products, and we need to rebuild soil carbon and nitrogen. And sustainable intensification is, I believe, the way to do this. This was a definition of sustainable intensification from the University of Oxford. The goal is to increase food production from existing farmland while minimising pressure on the environment, a response to increasing demand for food from a growing global population where land, water, energy and other inputs are in short supply, overexploited and used unsustainably. Any efforts to intensify food production must be matched by a concerted focus on making it sustainable. Failing to do so will undermine our capacity to continue producing food in the future. And these are the practices of sustainable intensification. Conservation agriculture, we immediately think of zero-till and mulches, but that also includes more diverse rotations, healthy soils, greater levels of soil carbon and nitrogen, efficient water management, use less water, improved genetic materials, crops, varieties, livestock that have genetic resistance, genetic input use efficiency, and integrated pest management. Now, each one of those has an advantage in its own right. But what sustainable intensification shows is that we get a synergistic effects of combining them where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so that's the real challenge as we're trying to have these more productive systems, but that are more resilient and with less risk. And the world is going down the pathway of agricultural sustainable intensification. This is a number of scientific reports from the Web of Science in 2019 showing that the number of publications in the last 10 years or so is absolutely going up, indicating that many others around the world are seeing sustainable intensification as the sensible pathway for more productive but more resilient systems that are also less harmful to the environment. And we know that it can work. This was a meta-analysis of conservation agriculture for sustainable intensification in South Asia, published in Nature last year. 9,686 paired site year comparisons. And what they found was that zero tillage with residue retention, a mean crop yield advantage of 5.8%, a water use efficiency increase of 12.6%, increase in net economic return of 26%, and a reduction of 12 to 33% in global warming potential. So we know that sustainable intensification can deliver on both production and environmental fronts. And sometimes you don't need a global meta-analysis to know what's going on. This is some work of Ken Sayer at CIMMYT on the left, around 10 or 11 years of conservation agriculture. On the right, farmer practices of no stubble retention, cultivation, etc. And you don't need statistical analysis to know that that system is working. But absolutely critical as we develop these new systems is the importance of soil health, critical for increasing returns and resilience and reducing risks. And so I believe that we need to be re-looking at a new version, not going back to where we were, a new version of more diverse farming systems in the cropping sense, the mixture of livestock, crops. Of course, we're still using zero-till, we're still using the best conservation agriculture practices, but we're putting them in a framework of more mixed returns to build diversity, to build resilience to climatic and to marketing shocks. Again, I'm quoting John Kierkegaard. Pasture phases are the most effective way to build stable soil organic matter, nitrogen fertility in their structure, and their absence from a rotation will eventually need to be considered. In most cases, continuous cropping will mine the nitrogen and soil fertility that was built up by previous pastures and may eventually create a challenge to maintain farm profitability. This mining of nitrogen may make sound economic sense initially, but if yield and quality levels are to be maintained or increased in the medium to long term, improved nutrient balance must be achieved. It's a very clear statement. What I'm saying now, John said this 4 years ago, some are taking action on it, but we need more to be doing so. And we know that it works. I have this old diagram here from my late and great friend Tony Ellington at Rutherglen, showing that with 1, 2, 3, 4 years of pasture, we built up soil nitrogen, and then with 1, 2, 3, 4 years of cropping, we ran that down, and then we went back into that cycle again. But we never ran that nitrogen down to where it started in the first place. We're spiraling up. And so the evidence is there. We now need to come into that in the Mark II because it will be absolutely critical for us in not only increasing productivity, but also increasing resilience and reducing risks through having more resilient systems. So what's already happening in risk management? We're seeing a number of things happening in Australia that, you know, some would have said wouldn't have happened. We're seeing a return of long fallowing in some of our farming systems. Now, I'll talk about it in a second. We're seeing more legumes come back into the systems, albeit mainly crop legumes, but using those in more diverse ways. We're seeing the reintroduction of livestock on the farms. A farm management colleague of mine said that in the region where he is, southeastern Australia, if farmers were leasing more land, it was also always leasing for more cropping. And he said, but now an increasing number of his clients are leasing land and actually putting livestock on there and having mixed farming systems there. And some real options to use stock containment facilities for reintroducing livestock into all cropping farms. And we're seeing this call, this clarion call from the growers that I speak to of the need for more regenerative and restorative systems. I had a group of farmers come to me in a talk that I gave, a similar talk to this one, saying, Tim, you know, we agree with everything you're saying, but we don't know how we can get from where we are now on our intensive cropping farms to where we want to be. And so that's a challenge for us as scientists and as farmers to work together to be able to put that roadmap there. Now, in just looking at a couple of these practices, it's really important to understand about how we've got where we are in those things. So this is a leading farm management consultant in 2019, the one that I just quoted now. And what he said was that, you know, and he's been in business 40 years with leading a large number of leading farmers. And he said, you know, many farmers, particularly younger ones, have switched from traditional mixed farming to more intensive farming systems involving no livestock at all. While these decisions may have been rationalised or justified on the basis of dubious economics or the notion that sheep are nasty for soil structure and incompatible with cropping, the reality is that many of these decisions have been made for reasons of personal choice or lifestyle. Now, that brings in the human factor. This is not just about new technologies. This is about helping people to understand that if they want to maintain their lifestyle, then the sustainability of their farm is critical, and that we need to be changing the way that we are doing things. These are real farm data, updated for me just a couple of weeks ago, again from a consultant with a large group of farmers. Canola wheat, they have the highest gross margins and the greatest potential returns. We've said that. But what he's saying is that amongst all of his clients, the intensive cropping farms spend $85 to $90 to gross $100. Whereas the mixed crop and livestock farms spend about $65 to $70 to gross $100. Now, the risk profiles there are clear for all to see. And it's absolutely critical that as our risks increase around climate, around markets, around supply chains, around pandemic uncertainties, that, of course, keeping returns at a profitable level, but doing so in a less risky way is absolutely critical. One of the practices that has come back, as I said before, that people wouldn't dream about is that long fallows have come back, and some excellent work by David Cann, James Hunt and Bill Malcolm show clearly that the cumulative cash flow of a 4,000 hectare farm here over a long simulated period, these ones at the top here are all systems that have fallow in them, whereas wheat is down here and canola wheat is here. And so you can see that over that run, the vast majority is that the cash flow is actually better from those systems that have wheat in them. And a leading farmer who I know extremely well said that he has reintroduced it because if he's not planting every paddock and he's fallowing some, it's more timely planting of the paddocks that he is sowing. It smooths his cash flow and reduces his risks. And that farmer may be in the audience here today. Of course, these fallows look very different. We're not talking about bare cultivated fallows. We're talking about fallows that have got mulching, that are zero till, but nevertheless, they're reducing the risk of farming and increasing overall productivity. Sustainable intensification, as I said, is I believe absolutely critical, but we need more research on it. This was a paper by Ken Cassman, a good friend, and Patricio Grassini in Nature last year. Despite general agreement about sustainable intensification, going down the bottom, little research on putting the components together in viable production systems and in quantifying sustainable intensification in terms of both production and environmental performance in farmers' fields rather than small manicured research plots. And that's a challenge for us. We're looking to take this on at Dookie, where we're looking to develop the Dookie Sustainable Agricultural Intensification Research Platform. We're looking to build a world-leading platform, certainly with based on what we've seen at Northwick and Rothamsted, but to be doing things differently and to be looking at a range of farming systems and providing quantifiable metrics on the comparative sustainability performance of each system. In our own research, we have an excellent ACR project here at the University of Melbourne, here at Dookie, where we're actually looking at conservation agriculture, sustainable intensification in Pacific Island countries and seeing what would it look like there in Samoa and Tonga in the smallholder farming systems that we have there. And I want to finish, Mr. Chairman, by just saying that the Crawford Fund is currently developing a new masterclass in sustainable agricultural intensification, which will help countries, people, regions to develop a roadmap to sustainable agricultural intensification around principles, practices, policy, people issues, scaling up, out and deep, and looking at the impacts of it through effective monitoring and evaluation. And so I'm going to finish there, Mr. Chairman, by saying that when I look back at my history in relation of scientists and farmers working together, it's clear that sustainability has been a moving target. We have had to change our farming system radically 3 years, over about 3 times over those 50 years. I believe now it's absolutely imperative that we make further changes as climatic risk, as market risk, as pandemic risks increase, if we are to keep our agri-food systems profitable, sustainable, productive, and more resilient. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, for that talk. We've got an extensive audience here. I'm just wondering now if people would like to raise their hand through the method in the raise hand function below, and we'll get some questions to Tim. Okay. I've got BP14, not sure who that is.
It's Banjo Patterson here, Tony. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yep.
No worries.
It's Banjo. Tim, congratulations on your presentation. It was most enlightening. You started off by talking about adjusting to risk, and I don't think anyone would disagree that we need to do that. You identified a number of risks that you observed had appeared on the horizon, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. I just wondered if you would like to comment on how you might see the risks over that period as compared to a longer time frame, particularly when we think about things like things that might have happened a long time ago that might have close links to what we might be facing now, things like the Spanish flu, transport, the impact of pirates even. People refer to the Great Drought in the past. We had pests like rabbits and that. Do you think the risks have changed in magnitude, or are we just going through an ongoing cycle of risk where we have been adapting to those risks in the past, and we will continue, particularly using the advice that you've been talking about today?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Banjo, and it would take some, a detailed study to look at that. What I will say is that I believe, and this was, it's not just me saying, this is what Sir John Beddington said, in 2009 about the perfect storm. It's the confluence of these risks, the simultaneous nature of them that are having the impacts that we're talking about, and we also have to take into account that when we go back to those things, global population was, 2 or 3 billion people. We're now talking about, a global population of pushing 8 billion people. So any risk that occurred, anything, it doesn't matter whether it was, an earthquake or a flood, etc. It could be of the same magnitude as we have now, but because there's so many more people around, greater population, greater infrastructure, the damage from a similar event is greater. And so I'm saying that it's magnified because we have the reality of a global population still growing at 160 people per minute who all need to be fed.
Thanks, Tim.
Laura, would you like to unmute and ask Tim a question, please?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, Tim. Nice to see you. Thank you.
Hola, Laura.
Lovely presentation. Very interesting, Tim. I really have a couple of questions. My first question is regarding to the project of the Victoria Drought Hub. It looks like the Stevie project with the hubs in Mexico. This Masacro project. Can you hear me?
It just broke up a little bit, Laura. If you could just repeat that last piece. I got the
Yes,
first,
just a second.
not the second.
So I'm just gonna change the network. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay, so what I was saying is like the Victoria Drought Hub seems to be a very interesting project. And the most important is it's bottom up, as you said, farmers, there is a farmer's participation. What will be the outcome behind that project in benefit of the farmers? Not only in the farmers, but the participation of all the community and how it will benefit farmers in terms of the whole community. That's one of
Yeah, that's a really good question, Laura. And obviously, in some sense, it remains to be seen. But what we believe is that by putting together this team and addressing priorities that are of a co-design nature. So yes, we will be having regional consultation, but the universities and Agriculture Victoria will be around that table as well. Other nodes may be around that table as well. And we believe that we'll get a greater focus on what we should be doing, as I say, before drought, during drought, and after drought. And that we will have a legacy of practices on farm for the environment and in communities. And we're looking at, we're looking at some major changes. So we're looking at how can we break the nexus between, the farms go down because it's drought and they take the local township with them because there's no money around. How can we break that nexus? How can we diversify so that communities are more resilient to what happens on the farms? And we're also looking at mental health before, during and after drought. And so we're getting all of the rural health departments of those universities and others working together for the first time and saying, well, what could we do better in relation to this? So we're going to tackle some big issues that, have not been tackled in that way before. And in that nexus issue, how can we put that threshold for drought on a dryland farm? How, if it's currently 200 millimeters of rain in the season, how can we get that down to 150? If it's in irrigated systems, things start to go wrong when water hits $650 a megalitre. How can we push that up to $850? And so we're really thinking about some different and big issues.
one more question. Sorry.
I think the chairman wants you to go to the next question.
Okay.
Another question. Sorry. Kate, I think.
Yeah, Kate.
Oh, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Tim. And I feel in this virtual audience that I should start by paying respects to the agricultural science elders. Certainly, I feel like I'm in royalty, or as one of my generation of ag scientists said one day after Tony Fisher took me to the airport and got me a drink in the Qantas lounge, Matt McCallum, the late Matt McCallum, said that's like having a beer with Booney or Steve Waugh. So it's great to be in this audience and listening to you, Tim. I guess my question, it's sort of a question and a comment. Through my own research recently and reviews of literature, I've been really fascinated by what's being called the farm effect, which is a term coined by Ross Kingwell after a millennial drought longitudinal study, where he found that of the 250 farms that they surveyed in Western Australia for a decade, that after statistical analysis, and they did extensive principal components analysis, that the single most important factor explaining differences between farms was actually the farm effect itself. So the individual management effect, rather than rainfall or soil type or all the agronomic things we've been discussing today. So to that end, I'm curious as to understand how in this new work that you're doing when running comparative farming systems and things like that, that you'll capture the farm effect and the people and the systems. And I guess, yeah, that's really my question to that end. And
yeah. Okay, Kate. Look, it's a fantastic question. One of the things that I did when I went to CIMMIT was, you know, I enlarged the acronym from G by E by M, genotype by environment by management, to G by E by M by P, people, and what we had, and whether, you know, and you could also have that P as policies, you know, because that influences what people do, etc. But I did mention it in my talk, you know, when I was saying about, you know, a lot of these changes have come from lifestyle choices, you know, that the people factor is absolutely critical. And you're spot on, Kate. Also, there was some work done about how, you know, the differences in how people had come out of the Millennium Drought on Eyre Peninsula in South Australia that Ed Hunt and a couple of others did. And it was around decision making, you know, it was around not being the first, about not buying new machinery, you know, those things. And it's absolutely critical. And, you know, we're looking at it in a number of industries. And I'm in Northern Victoria here, and the dairy industry is, you know, looking to make some major changes of going away from irrigated pasture to fodder crops and all of those sorts of things. But, you know, the knowledge and the wherewithal to grow those fodder crops in the most productive ways are not in the normal arsenal of you know, the dairy farmer, etc. So it's an absolutely critical factor, and that's why, you know, at these bigger levels, these audiences here, it's just saying that this is what we need to take up. And in the end, when we're looking at introducing this elsewhere, we're looking about how do you change curricula in schools and universities. You know, how do you do that, you know, and how do you change many things? And it's as big a challenge, you know, of getting those things done as it is of getting a population to be changing dramatically to live with a pandemic. So I'm absolutely not understating that at all.
no, I think you summed it up beautifully, actually. And I guess just to add to the conversation, and I hope this is okay, Bill and Tony, but I just wanted to alert people of this publication that I put together last year, Crops, People, Money and You, The Art of Excellent Farming and Better Returns. And effectively what I've tried to do is synthesize all the research that I could find and my own observations of 30 years in the industry and following the likes of good farmers like Tony Gregson to put together, I guess, my roadmap to excellent farming. So that may be of interest to people in the room, including yourself and your group, Tim.
Nice one, Kate.
Tony Fisher.
Yes, thank you. Tim, thanks for stimulating, comprehensive and challenging talk. Really great. And it's great to see Dookie back on the map. I think that's wonderful. I'll try and keep it brief. I think it was Václav Smil who said that half of food nitrogen comes from Haber-Bosch, comes from nitrogen fertilizer. Half of food nitrogen in the whole world. It's going to be very difficult to move away from nitrogen fertilizer. I guess much of the other half comes from running down soil organic carbon. So that's how dependent we are on nitrogen fertilizer. And if we want to, of course, we can improve the efficiency of fertilizer use quite a bit, but in the end of the day, we still have to meet that food nitrogen need. And that's a lot of nitrogen. And if we want to build soil organic carbon, we have to also include 80 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of soil organic carbon, not to mention the phosphorus. So it's very difficult to see that we're going to be able to do it with legumes. Perhaps we can improve the efficiency of legumes. There hasn't been enough breeding of legumes. I agree with that, especially for nitrogen fixation. I'm actually hoping that we will have renewable energy generating hydrogen on farm to make ammonia for fertilisation, efficient fertilisation of our crops. Thank you.
Yeah, really a good point, Tony. Yes, that Delhi Chen often quotes that figure. I think like 55% of the protein in human diets comes from nitrogen fertilizer. Yeah, it's not going to be, as I say to the students, this is not going to be something like you change tomorrow. What we're talking about is the emphasis, the options. We've got the options. And, you know, in Australia, as I said, once upon a time, we were at a ratio of about 20 to 1, you know, of our farming systems in Australia, 20 kilograms coming from biological nitrogen fixation and 1 from fertilizer. And we've, you know, that ratio has changed dramatically. I'm saying, well, you know, we've done it before. We can do it not just the same again, but we can do it better again. And but it will be, yes, we're not going to live in a world without nitrogen fertilizer. But, you know, nitrogen fertilizer, as we know, comes from the gasification process. It's a product of fossil fuels. We've got plenty of people looking at how you can heat and cool houses and run vehicles without using fossil fuels. But we've got very few people looking at how to produce nitrogen fertilizer without using fossil fuels. So that's another challenge for us. So it will be an integrated systems approach, not one or the other. And that's what we have learned. But I just, following up on you, Kate, when I went for an interview to be Director General of CIMMYT, Tony Fisher picked me up at the airport, and I was like you. I thought that I was, you know, in there with Steve Waugh.
All right. Any more questions? All right. I'll hand over to Rob Velthurst, Chairman, Ag Institute Australia, Victoria. Would you like to come on now, Rob, please?
Thanks, Bill. Tim, on behalf of the Ag Institute Australia and the Crawford Fund, thank you for your talk on resilience, risk and return, and the role of sustainable agricultural intensification. I think over the last 40 years, we've seen this dramatic increase in farm size in Australia, and during that time in Australia, we've seen farmers intensify their cropping systems. This increased productivity risk, as you point out, is against this greater seasonal marketing, supply chain, and more recently the pandemic risk. And the challenge, as you say, is to increase the production on existing farmland while further minimising the effect of the environment. This is really about producing more with less. I think it's fantastic that we've started to see money flowing out of the Australian Future Drought Fund. I think there's something like $100 million a year flowing out of that into the future, into projects like the Victorian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. And I think it's fantastic that you're involving the farming groups in this project, you know, Birchip Cropping Group, Southern Farming Systems, Riverine Plains. It's just amazing that you've been able to sort of incorporate them in, as I think, you know, the leading growers in these groups really understand the risks and returns from farming. And I'm sure they'll help drive that necessary change for sustainable intensification and more resilient farming systems into the community. Now, it's not just about their own farms, as someone pointed out, it's about the communities, the farming communities, and it's wider than just farmers. So your leadership in setting up this hub is much appreciated by the agriculture industry. And I think, well, I personally, and I think there's a range of people look forward to these new technologies and ideas that will further drive productivity on farms, further drive profits, and hopefully reduce the risk of farming into the future. It's a major challenge to feed the world in the next 30 years. And I think these technologies, as with the past, need to have a strong field evidence base, not just laboratory studies or small plot studies. And I think they'll be driven by this wonderful community we have in Australia of professional, practical agricultural scientists, and delivered by hand in hand with these resilient, leading large growers. So thank you, Tim. Much appreciated on behalf of the Ag Institute Australia and the Crawford Fund.
Thank you.
I'll hand back to Bill. Is there any final comments, Bill?
Thanks for that, Rob. I've got one question. James Saunders, would you like to ask that?
Sorry about that. I can't hear you, James. You might have to put your video off.
Yeah,
You know?
that's better.
Yeah, all right. Problems with the headset, sorry. Look, I just wanted to part, and look, really appreciate that. And look, I haven't been involved with the group before, so I certainly really appreciate it. You might have seen one of my comments. I just sort of mentioned to you, because I think it is important to the group. Currently at the moment, Australian growers are having to be certified as sustainable. The industry's gone with a program called ICC, which is a global program, which is originally started with canola and you talked about market access going into Europe under the Renewable Energy Biofuel Directive. So last year we certified over 5,000 growers representing 2.5 million tonnes of grain, and growers were getting a $10 premium in that marketplace. So it's quite, substantial. So my role is on behalf of the industry to facilitate that program, and we are going on farm and actually at randomly selecting and auditing growers, but it's based on 6 pillars, the ICC program, but there's also a very important social aspect to it as well, that growers have to comply, and use of chemicals, the whole lot. And this year under the Renewable Energy Directive out of Europe, there's an additional requirement that growers have to meet a biodiversity aspect to it, as well as an aspect of 5% of their arable land has to be under species that promote pollinators. So you talk about sustainability, this is growing dramatically, and growers are up to their eyeballs in it at the moment. And it's also extended into other grains, like the maltsters are now wanting ICC accredited barley. It's rolled into other grains. So I just thought I'd mention that to the group. And the industry is really pushing, but we do need assistance. When we go onto farms and audit, growers are meant to measure their soil carbon aspect because it's got a carbon aspect. I'm coming across growers still that do not do any soil testing whatsoever anymore. So there's some real practical data that we're seeing during these audit processes that, as a group, and, I'm talking to the farmer organisations, because it's all about market access, from that aspect. So I just thought I'd mention, that growers are up to their eyeballs in this sustainability with a, real financial imperative where they're, they won't get into these markets otherwise. So I just thought I'd mention that, Bill and Tim, if you're unaware of this is happening, at the moment. And we did do audits in Victoria last year. So, the independent auditors are actually going on farm and looking at chemical usage, storage, how chemicals are stored, how they're used, reduction in energy, good management practices. So I just thought I'd mention that to you if you weren't aware this is happening right now. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, James. Yep. Got a big project at the University of Melbourne on soil carbon measurements, including biome measurements. Thank you. Over to you, Bill.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Tim. I think we'll wrap now. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's been a big day, and thanks for your presence. Good on you. Thank you. Bye for now.